100% sure where we left off, but not that. We need to take a test. Okay, so we're talking about the feeding of the 5,000. And so we talk about the importance of the miracle. It's the only miracle that is recorded, a miracle of Jesus that is recorded in all four Gospels. And it was performed, I don't like that word performed, but whatever. Jesus did this miracle in front of thousands of people, more than 5,000, because it was 5,000 men that were there. It was a miracle of creation. He took a small amount of food and he created enough food for the whole crowd. So a miracle of creation is, in some sense, even more spectacular than healing something that is already in existence. I don't know if that makes sense, but it was a miracle of creation. It's a picture of Christ as the bread of life, as the one who provides salvation and provides for our needs and is the bread of life. And so the occasion of the miracle was during a time of rest. I wouldn't call it a vacation, but whatever. This part isn't so important. It was near the time of Passover. Passover was at hand. And then we talked about growing our faith and how trials and difficulties can help us to grow in our faith. And when we refuse to look at what God can do and what God will do for us, we, in some sense, live as virtual atheists. So trials test or grow our faith, and failure is looking at outward circumstances rather than God's power over those circumstances. And I talked about both about my son Josh and how God drew him back to himself in a way that I could not have imagined. And then I also talked about, did I finish the story about Katie's birth?
Yes.
And how I tried to solve that problem myself and didn't do a very good job. And God ended up making it even more wonderful and beautiful than I could have imagined. And then the miracle itself, I don't know if that's where we left off. I think
we haven't filled out any of the miracles.
I haven't filled out any of this. Okay, so let's start here then. Jesus said, have the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, so they were full. All right, this wasn't like communion, where you take the bread and the grape juice or the wine or whatever your church uses and go, oh man, I don't need lunch. No, it wasn't like that, right? They were really full. And he told his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments. So there's stuff left over. He has supplied abundantly more than was necessary. And so they gathered up the fragments that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, this is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. So this story reveals Christ's sovereignty. So this is what the miracle tells us about Jesus. First, it reveals his sovereignty in 2 ways. In his omniscience, I thought that was going to be in his omniscience. He knew what he was going to do. He knew what was happening. And he knew he would provide for the people. And so he didn't test Philip and Andrew to figure it out. Like, what are we going to do? He already knew. And he already knew that it would grow Andrew and Philip's faith in him. So his question was to reveal to Andrew and Philip his own lack of faith and to help him grow in that. And then, so his omniscience and in his knowledge of what he would do. He knew he would feed the 5,000. He was in complete control of this situation. However, there is something that was required. It required the obedience of his disciples. It required that they do what he asked them to do, which was to distribute the food. Simple task, right? Simple task. But they could have said, why are we going to hand out these few loaves and fish? It's not going to go to 3 people and then we're done. They could have said, this is ridiculous. This is stupid. But they didn't. They obeyed. Yes, sir. Can you wait just a little bit? And it did. It grew their faith. You know, why make people sit down if you don't have enough food to feed them? But he did. And so God had spoken. And even though they didn't understand, even though it didn't make sense, even though it seemed stupid, they did what Jesus asked of them. And that should be true of us. When God tells us to do something, even if we go, really? We need to obey. We need to obey what he has asked us to do. And that's hard sometimes, isn't it? There was a time for me when this was particularly hard. I think you already know that what qualifies me to be your Bible teacher, and I believe that this was the purpose of that whole 13 years, is that I wrote and taught Bible studies for the women at my church for 13 years. In November of 2014, maybe not, maybe somewhere in there, I felt God saying, it's time to let it go. I was like, that's not God. That can't be God. Because look at all these women that are coming, and I love doing this, and this is been a blessing to me and to other women, and so I just kind of ignored it, and it kept coming back. Time to lay it down. Time to lay it down. And at some point in early December, I realized that if I continued to push back on what the Spirit was telling me, that I would be arguing with God. And I remembered a sermon years before that my pastor had given about the danger of arguing with God. And I realized that I couldn't continue to do that. So I went to the director of women's ministries and I said, I don't know why, but God's telling me to leave. God's telling me it's time for me to move. And so in early January, the second week of a study on the Gospel of Mark, and I had just taught on the disciples laying down their nets to follow Jesus, laying aside what they were doing to go in a different direction to follow Jesus. And so I told them, there is a net, and it's a net that I love, that God is calling me to lay down, and that net is Bible study. And here's what I said, not knowing anything. I said, what I hear God telling me is that he has something for me, and I can't say yes to that until I say no to this. And so I'm laying the net of Bible study down. Now, here's the thing. 2 years earlier, I'd gotten a crazy phone call from Mrs. Schrog saying, what would you think about teaching elementary PE? And I kind of went, yeah, right? And I said yes to that, right? I ended up saying yes to that, and I loved it. I mean, if you don't get a kick out of watching kindergartners learn to skip, there's something wrong with you. I mean, I told people, like, I could sell tickets for this. Like, I could make money off of this. You want to come watch some kindergartners learn how to skip and do jumping jacks? Yes. And it was fun. I mean, I laughed my way through that entire time. And so because I loved it, I thought, I want to keep doing this. And so I decided I needed to get my license back. And I thought, you know what, as long as I'm going to get my PE endorsement back, why wouldn't I get my social studies endorsement back? So I did both of them. And so the day after Bible study ended, I did my student teaching. I called myself the world's oldest student teacher. I had to do 3 weeks of student teaching. My student teaching for the PE part was just what I normally did, doing the classes I normally did 2 days a week. And then in the afternoons, I would go over and student teach in the high school. And I student taught under Mrs. Hanson and under Mr. Kozak. And what I discovered was, man, I still really love being in the classroom. I still really love teenagers. This is cool. I enjoy this. So one day I walked into the teacher workroom there, and the master schedule for the next year was there. And where Mrs. Hanson's name should have been, it said middle school teacher. And my first thought was, oh my gosh, Mrs. Hanson's retiring. The kids are going to be so sad. And my second thought was, I want that job. And I didn't ask for that job, partly because it was social studies, which I was endorsed in, but it was also language arts. It was also 8th grade English, which I was not endorsed in, although it was the exact same curriculum I used with my own children. So I didn't say anything. But Mrs. Schrag called me in and said, we'd like to hire you full-time in the middle school. And I said, yes. She said, maybe you should go home, talk to Beth, pray about it. Look, here's the thing. Way back in November, and this is now like April, way back in November when God said, lay it down, I didn't believe him. But he was preparing me for something better. And it was really hard for me to give up Bible study. I loved it. But here's the deal. That had a purpose. That 13 years had a purpose. And I do it every day. Every day I stand before you and teach you the Bible. And I'm only able to do that because I spent 13 years doing it. And so sometimes it can be hard. Sometimes God can tell us to do something and it can be like, yeah, I don't want to do that. That's dangerous. And there is great joy that comes in obedience. So much joy that comes in obedience. There are biblical examples of this where people have disobeyed and it's gone poorly. Well, why can't we eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? The fruit looks good. And then there's also great blessings that have come. Moses pushed back on God, argued with God. But look at the blessing that came when he obeyed. And that is true in our lives too. Now, the next one is this, that it shows God's orderliness. This is true, but like Jesus' manliness, it's not the most important. Yes, God is orderly. He created the universe, which is orderly. Every once in a while it goes crazy, and we have winds, 70-degree days in the middle of December, and winds that blow semis off the interstate. But generally, God is orderly. And then it reveals Christ's omnipotence. He is able to use even the smallest things to accomplish his purposes. He used the tears of baby Moses to move the heart of Pharaoh's daughter. He used a rod by Moses to confound the Pharaoh of Egypt. He takes little things and with them he accomplishes great things. He uses little things like you and me to do his purposes. And then it shows the blessing that comes from serving, from obeying. The disciples did what he said. They walked in obedience and they distributed the food. What if they would have refused? They would have missed out on that blessing. And that blessing was so great that there were 12 baskets left over. Look, God always blesses us beyond measure. God, if we have learned nothing else in the last week, God does immeasurably more than we can ask or imagine. And then it reveals Christ's sufficiency. He is enough. There is a lie in our culture that says you are enough. You are not enough. I am not. But he is enough. And he can do what he purposes to do. I may purpose to do something. I have always thought like the greatest feeling ever would be to slam dunk a basketball. Like on a 10-foot hoop, right? Like, wouldn't that be like, even better if it was like a 360 set? That ain't happening for me, right? Unless it's a little tight suit. And I used to trash talk my children. But anyway, and I still do. But yeah. Well, thank you. Maybe in heaven, I'll be able to get. But yeah, but we are not enough. We are not enough. We need Jesus. And then we're going to talk a little bit. We're going to go through this really, really quickly. So there's a feeding of the 5,000. Anybody ever does anybody know about the other mass feeding that Jesus did?
Oh,
it was like 3,000?
4,000.
4,000.
So we have the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. Feeding of the 5,000 is the only one in all four Gospels. The feeding of the 4,000 is in, I think, like Matthew. It's in Matthew and Mark. That's what it's in Matthew and Mark. And so, what are the differences? And the similarities, of course, are what he did. But what are the differences between the two? So. Mark, so there's 5,000, there's 4,000. So there was a different amount of food. There were 2 fish and 5 loaves, a few fish and 7 loaves. Difference in number, of course. And then this is a mosaic, 2 different mosaics in ancient churches near the Sea of Galilee, commemorating the feeding of the 5,000 to 4,000. They aren't accurate because they were done thousands of years later, but it's going to tell you about that anyway. So these are different kinds of baskets. The kophanos was a basket that was a little bit smaller, and you kind of carried it like this. And then the spurus is a bigger basket where you have this. So that would have been like to carry a boy's lunch, and this would have been to carry like you're going off with your 3 babies on a vacation, and you got to have all that stuff in the bag, kind of thing. And this was used. The spurus was used by Gentiles. The kophanos was used by Jews. And then there's a different number of baskets remaining. So there were 12 baskets that remained in the feeding of the 5,000 and 7 that remained in the feeding of the 4,000. 12 might be a reminder of, what do we worry about? The 12 tribes of Israel, or 7 being the perfect number. It really doesn't matter. And we can't know for sure what the significance is between the 2 numbers. It's just 2 miracles, mostly. Now, let's talk about Jesus walking on the water. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Perceiving that they were about to come and take him by force and make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. So Jesus leaves that area. He sends his disciples out into the boat, and he leaves because the people were going to want to make him king. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, this is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. So the people want to make Jesus king, and then the disciples in the boat end up being in trouble because of the storm that came up. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed for 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near to the boat and frightened. This often happens even today on the Sea of Galilee, that the winds whip up a very fast storm, And in this case, they probably came through that, those winds came through the cavern. Okay. When they had rowed for about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near to the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was going where they landed, or went where it was going. So, the people wanted to make Jesus king for all the wrong reasons. They wanted a political king. They wanted someone who would get rid of the Romans. That is not why Jesus came. And they didn't see him as Messiah. They saw him as someone who would save them from Rome. And if he could multiply food like that, surely he could overthrow Caesar. But that was not his purpose. Not only was it not his time, that was not his purpose. So he leaves and he tells the disciples to go down, get in the boat, and go to Capernaum. And after a time, we've got this churning sea because of a storm, and it made them afraid. These are fishermen, so this had to be a bad storm because they were on the Sea of Galilee all the time. They'd seen many storms. If they were afraid, then it would have must have been a horrible storm. And it's still true that happens on the Sea of Galilee. And so Jesus comes walking on the water, which is another miracle, of course. And now they're afraid of him. And he says, "Don't be afraid, it is I." In the Greek, that's phrase, "it is I," is ego eimi. And it means I am, which is the same name as God's self-revelatory name, Yahweh. Jesus is again telling them who he is. He says, "Don't be afraid, I am God." And he is assuring them of that. And so here is the lesson that stands out in this: trust and obey God. His every command. Trust God and obey his every command. He knows what he's doing, even when we don't think he knows what he's doing. He knows. So we'll stop there. I'll see how much time we have left. 9:48. Okay, we got very little time. We're going to give it a shot. See what we can get done. We'll finish it tomorrow and do this Accuser quiz tomorrow. I'm just going to eyeball it.
I have a question. So, these miracles, a lot of times said it took place during Passover. Passover, like a thing that happens once yearly, or does it happen every
My pleasure, dude.
That's all.
Is it the 17th or the 16th?
The Passover.
16.
16th? I did get the date right.
Nice.
Yes.
Use an extra one.
Okay, so number one. Approximately how much time passed between the end of John 5 and the events of John 6? The answer is D, about 1 year. We don't know that for sure, but it was Passover again, we know that. Most of the book of John deals with which portion of Christ's ministry? Read about that. The last third. So we're going to have, we're not going to get to chapter 14 is like the last days of Christ's. And there's 21, right? So the last third of John deals with The longest portion of John deals with the end of Christ's ministry. So most of the book of John deals with which portion of Christ's ministry, and it's the last third. Philip and Andrew failed Christ's test of them because they failed to exercise faith. The fact that Christ had the people sit down in groups before he fed them reveals his orderliness and probably his manliness.
Yep. 100%.
Can't forget that.
But that's not really important. That's not on your final exam. The fact that Christ had the disciples gather the leftovers reveals the importance of Christian stewardship of resources.
Stinginess.
Stinginess. They were going to make him king and wanted to crown him, but that wasn't what God's plan was for it, so he went away.
Right. So they wanted to make him king so that he'd overthrow the Romans. That was not God's plan. He knew that couldn't happen. And so, because they wanted to make him king for the wrong reason. They wanted him to overthrow Rome. And so he didn't allow that to happen.
I vote Jesus for president.
Oh, fully prepared. You do studying, of course, you should be fully prepared. Those of you that have not yet taken the units test, that needs to be done either on Teams or come to the study hall. You can take it through your study hall, come to me and get get it. But here, this is what you do on your own. It's just going to be easier.
I think so. I think maybe it's closer.